I was flying my old Wanderer through Sector 19 when all the instruments went insane. And I'm not exaggerating, they literally started showing impossible readings. The energometer spun backward, the temperature sensors registered -1,000 Kelvin, and the navigation computer gave coordinates for a place that couldn't exist according to any law of physics, the center of the galaxy, but with negative mass. At first, I thought it was just a system glitch. My ship's 40 years old, and half the wiring's held together by tape and luck. But then the comms exploded with messages from science stations, and I realized everyone was seeing it. It was real. And it was something so bizarre, my brain refused to process it. I tried to turn around and get away from the anomaly, but the ship felt like it was stuck in invisible syrup. The engines were running at full power, but the speed kept dropping, as if something was draining energy straight from the reactor. Lights on the control panel dimmed one by one. Backup batteries showed full charge, yet the bridge lighting faded into a weak orange glow. I opened the emergency comm channel and heard pure panic. Dozens of voices, pilots, engineers, scientists, all shouting the same thing. The stars were going out. Entire systems were losing power, and it was spreading like a wave from the galactic center. Some claimed it was a Terran weapon, others blamed the architects, and one lunatic swore he saw his star just vanish, leaving behind a black hole in space. I turned off the comms. The chorus of terror was splitting my head, and tried to focus on the instruments. I needed to understand what was happening. The sensors showed an object at the very heart of the galaxy, the size of an entire star system, emitting waves of some kind of radiation my scanners couldn't even classify. It looked like anti-energy, the negation of everything that exists. Each wave passed through the ship, and with every pulse, the systems got worse. First, the autopilot went down, then climate control, then even the mechanical door lock started glitching. I pulled out an old paper star atlas I'd bought at a junk market as a joke, and for the first time in 10 years, I regretted not learning old-school navigation without computers. But the worst part wasn't that. The worst part was the cold I could feel, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was something metaphysical, like the very idea of warmth, motion, and life was slowly draining out of reality, leaving behind absolute stillness and silence. I looked out the viewport and saw distant stars losing their brightness one by one, fading first into dull red points, then disappearing completely, as if some giant eraser was wiping them from the fabric of space. That's when I understood, whatever had appeared in the galactic center, it didn't just threaten civilizations or planets, it threatened the existence of matter, of energy, of everything. And I had a choice. Try to run and die in the dark or fly toward it and find out what it was, while I still could steer the ship. I reached the nearest trading station, the crossroads of 7 ways, and immediately realized I'd stepped into pure hell. Humans, architects, and hive representatives were literally tearing each other apart right in the docks. Terran soldiers shouted that those silicon bastards had activated some kind of ancient weapon. The architects broadcasted accusations that biological life forms had created an energy-consuming virus, and the hive attacked everyone indiscriminately, convinced it was a plot against their collective mind. I tried to make my way to the fuel reservoirs, but 3 different patrols from different factions stopped me, and each time I had to prove that my old Wanderer couldn't possibly carry any kind of superweapon. Its shields barely worked as it was. The news channels had turned into an endless stream of military propaganda and conspiracy theories. I saw a Terran admiral announce full fleet mobilization and the closure of all borders. An architect representative publicly claiming their calculations proved the anomaly was of biological origin. And the queen of one hive sending a telepathic message saying she felt the presence of a hostile intelligence in the very structure of space itself. Trade routes were shutting down one after another. Whole colonies were declaring evacuation. And I watched transports packed with people to the brim, desperately trying to escape systems that lay in the path of the spreading energy decay. Fuel prices shot up tenfold in an hour. Food vanished from shelves, and on the black market people were selling coordinates of supposedly safe sectors for fortunes. I sat in a diner on the station's third level, listening to pilots trade rumors. Some swore they'd seen a Terran dreadnought with experimental weaponry heading toward the galactic center. Others said the architects were building a massive computational matrix to calculate countermeasures. And one freighter captain whispered that the hive had already begun consuming entire worlds, turning them into biomass for some kind of ritual. Then, a patrol of Terran military police came into the bar and started checking everyone for espionage. They dragged people into interrogation rooms, scanned implants, confiscated navigation data. I realized I was in the heart of an interspecies panic, where anyone could become an enemy just for being the wrong race, and that if I didn't get out of there immediately, they'd either conscript me or accuse me of sabotage. When I finally got back to the Wanderer, I found that all three factions had searched my ship. Terrans looking for banned weapons, architects scanning for anomalous energy signatures, and the Hive had left their biomarkers on the hull, tagging the ship as a potential threat. The comm systems were flooded with military orders and curfews. Dock workers refused to refuel civilian ships without special clearance, and I saw a firefight break out in the next hangar between a Terran frigate and an architect vessel over control of an evacuation corridor. I started the engines at minimum power and began to drift away from the station, realizing that the entire galactic order had collapsed in a matter of hours, that civilizations which had upheld a fragile peace for millennia were now ready to destroy each other, and that I, a lone pilot with a decommissioned freighter, somehow had to make it through this chaos and uncover the truth about the Cold Star before everyone died in a pointless war. I got in touch with an old acquaintance named Marcus, a smuggler who dealt not only in contraband, but in information. He had access to databases that even military intelligence didn't know existed. We met on an abandoned maintenance station somewhere on the edge of the sector, and I told him I needed any archived data about anomalies in galactic centers, any scientific reports that might have been classified or erased. Marcus looked at me like I'd just asked him to pull a star out of the sky, then smirked and said he might have something interesting. Files he'd stolen from an architect research station years ago and couldn't sell because no one could figure out what they even were. He uploaded terabytes of encrypted data onto my system and warned me that if anyone found out I was reading it, they'd track me down and wipe me out along with my ship. I spent 3 sleepless days digging through those archives, running the data through my ancient computer and trying to piece together a picture from the fragments. What I found froze my blood. Similar anomalies had been recorded in different galaxies with terrifying regularity, roughly every 4.7 billion years, always in galactic centers, always with the same energy signature. There were reports from ancient civilizations that had observed the phenomenon in neighboring galaxies through massive telescopes, mathematical models from the architects describing the spread of the decay waves, even philosophical treatises from extinct species trying to explain the nature of the event. The most horrifying thing was that all this data was classified at the highest level. Governments of all 3 races knew about it, but kept it hidden from the public. I dug deeper into the timeline and saw a pattern that made my skin crawl. After each appearance of the anomaly, every trace of advanced civilization in that galaxy vanished. All technological signals, all radio transmissions, gone. Planets remained untouched. Stars kept burning once the energy returned, but intelligent life capable of space travel no longer existed. Only primitive forms, microorganisms, maybe simple multicellular organisms. There were photos of dead cities on planets in other galaxies, taken by probes millions of years after the events. Buildings still standing, roads intact, but not a single sign that beings with technology had ever lived there. It wasn't war. It wasn't a disaster. It wasn't an explosion. It was a precise, surgical removal of intelligence itself, as if something was erasing only consciousness while leaving everything else untouched. In one of the files, I found a study by a group of Terran xenoarchaeologists who had explored ruins in the Andromeda Galaxy and discovered strange inscriptions carved into stone shortly before that civilization disappeared. They wrote about a cold star that came to take their minds, saying it wasn't a weapon or an accident, but something intentional, something with a purpose. The scientists suggested it might be a mechanism for cleansing galaxies of intelligent life, triggered by some ancient force or automated system. But their report was confiscated by intelligence agencies a week after publication, and the researchers themselves vanished without a trace. I sat in my ship's cockpit, staring at the screen with that data, realizing that our galaxy wasn't facing a weapon built by any race. It was facing something far worse, a system that had existed for billions of years, systematically wiping out civilizations that reached a certain level of development. And we might only have weeks left before everything we are is erased from existence. I sent an encrypted message through several underground channels, places where people who had nothing left to lose usually gathered: deserters, exiles, dissident scientists, anyone who didn't fit the official version of reality. I wrote that I was looking for a crew for an expedition to the cold star, that it was probably a suicide mission, but that I had data that could explain what was really happening. 2 people responded: an architect named Quartz-9, who had deserted from the computational fleet after refusing to work on a weapon of mass destruction, and a being from the Hive who called itself Symbiote, exiled from the collective mind for asking too many uncomfortable questions. We met on neutral ground, in an old hangar on a dead moon, and I showed them the data from the archives. Quartz-9 processed the information in seconds and confirmed the mathematical accuracy of the models, while Symbiote said its hive also sensed something ancient and alien in the structure of the anomaly. The plan was insane, but it was the only one that made any sense. My Wanderer ran on an old chemical engine that didn't depend on power grids or quantum reactors. It literally burned fuel and expelled it out the back, generating thrust in the most primitive way possible. All modern ships with their fusion drives, warp systems, and antimatter engines were useless in the cold star's zone of influence. Their systems simply shut down, their energy faded, and they became dead coffins drifting through space. The fleets of all 3 races had already encountered this. They'd sent squadrons toward the galactic center, but the ships either lost control and crashed or vanished without a trace. Quartz-9 suggested modifying my ship by installing mechanical navigation and control systems, completely abandoning electronics, while Symbiote said it could create a biological interface to monitor our condition, since even our bodies would start losing energy in the decay zone. We spent a week turning the Wanderer into something between a spaceship and a World War II-era submarine, replacing all digital instruments with analog mechanical ones, installing hand-operated levers instead of joysticks, removing all computers, and replacing them with paper charts and mechanical calculators. Quartz-9 built a primitive computing device out of scrap metal, running on gears and springs, capable of calculating trajectories without a single volt of electricity. Symbiote integrated its biological sensors into the ship's walls, living tissue that could detect changes in the environment and transmit information through chemical signals. I looked at what my ship had become and realized we were going back 3 centuries in terms of technology. But it was the only way to approach an anomaly that killed everything modern. Before launch, we loaded as much chemical fuel as the ship could hold, took supplies of water and canned food for 3 months, and each of us wrote a farewell letter. I sent mine to old Marcus, asking him to release the archive data publicly if we didn't return. Quartz-9 left his computational models in a secure repository for other architects, and Symbiote separated part of its biomass and sent it back to the Hive, hoping its memories would survive in the collective mind. We all knew there was almost no chance of coming back. The other fleets, with their powerful engines and shields, had been destroyed or crippled by the decay waves, and we were flying an antique relic that belonged in a museum. But we had something the military didn't. We knew the truth. That this thing appeared every few billion years, that it deliberately erased civilizations, and that if we didn't find out why it was happening, and whether it could be stopped, then in a few weeks, our entire galaxy would become a silent desert of dead worlds and extinguished stars. The first 2 weeks of the journey went relatively smoothly. We were running on chemical thrust, Quartz 9 manually calculating our trajectory on his mechanical counting device, while Symbiote reported on the ship's condition through biological sensors that pulsed in different colors along the bridge walls. Then, we crossed the first boundary of the dead zone, and everything changed. First, the last electronic instruments we'd kept for monitoring shut down. Then, my bioimplants, wired into my nervous system to enhance reflexes, started to glitch. I could feel the connection between my brain and the implants fading, like someone was slowly pulling the battery out of my body, and within hours, they were completely dead, leaving a strange emptiness along my spine. Quartz 9 reported that his silicon structure was also losing coherence. He could no longer process complex calculations at his usual speed. His thoughts were slowing down, becoming more primitive. A week after entering the zone, we lost fire. I tried to light the burner to heat up some food, but the flame wouldn't hold. It flickered, shrank, and went out, as if combustion itself was becoming impossible. The temperature inside the ship began to drop, even though the chemical heater was running at full capacity. The thermometers read -50, then -100, then the needle went off the scale. We wrapped ourselves in every warm thing we had on board, but the cold cut through any insulation. It wasn't a normal kind of cold, not something clothing or heating could stop. It was the decay of thermal energy itself at the molecular level. Symbiote suffered the most. Its biological body required a stable temperature, and I could see its tissues starting to crystallize, frosting over, its movements growing slower and more painful. We shut down the engine and drifted on inertia, because even the chemical fuel reaction was starting to fail. The fuel wouldn't ignite properly, the process grew weaker and less efficient, and we knew we'd soon lose even this primitive propulsion. I looked through the viewport and saw absolute darkness. The stars around us had gone out. Space had turned into a black void without a single point of light. Only far ahead was the strange glow of the cold star, but it wasn't normal light. It was inverted, as if it was emitting anti-light that absorbed the surrounding darkness. Symbiote went into hibernation, its body curling into a cocoon to preserve what little heat and energy remained. While Quartz 9 had almost stopped moving, his silicon structure slowed to near total mental shutdown. I was the only one still conscious, shaking from a cold that pierced to the bone, realizing we might not make it to the destination. It was then, in that frozen darkness, when I had almost lost hope, that I understood something important. The cold star wasn't just draining energy or stealing heat and motion. It was doing something far more fundamental. It was returning matter to a quantum state of uncertainty, to the condition that existed before the collapse of the wave function, before particles chose a specific position and energy. I remembered the quantum physics lectures I'd taken at the Academy 100 years ago. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the idea that particles exist in superposition until observed. The cold star was erasing the observers, erasing the consciousness that collapses the wave function, and matter was reverting to pure potentiality. Where there is no defined energy, no fixed position, nothing concrete, just an infinite cloud of probabilities. That explained everything. Why planets remained intact, but civilizations vanished. Why our technology failed. Why even fire couldn't burn. Because combustion itself required certainty. It required electrons to exist on specific orbits, making specific transitions. In the cold star's zone of influence, that certainty was dissolving, fading into a quantum fog of uncertainty. When we finally reached the epicenter, I didn't see a star. I saw a structure so vast that my mind refused to comprehend it as a single object. It was a machine the size of an entire solar system, made up of concentric rings and spheres rotating in impossible directions, passing through each other without colliding, as if existing in different dimensions at once. The surface was covered with shifting patterns, geometric forms unknown to Euclidean geometry, symbols that hurt to look at, structures that were both flat and three-dimensional. I realized I was looking at technology that operated by laws opposite to everything we know about physics. Rather than increasing entropy, this machine reduced it. Instead of dispersing energy, it gathered it back into a state of pure order. Quartz-9 somehow regained consciousness. Its silicon structure began to resonate with the artifact's radiation, receiving information directly, not through senses, but straight into its computational matrix. It told me that inside this structure was a library, a repository of consciousnesses from millions of civilizations erased over trillions of years of the machine's existence. Every race, every culture, every sentient being that had ever reached a certain level of development across hundreds of galaxies was recorded here. Not their bodies or technologies, but the very patterns of their consciousness, the structures of their thoughts, the essence of what made them intelligent. I asked why. Why keep these records if the civilizations were gone anyway? Quartz-9 answered that the machine didn't destroy, it preserved. It conserved intelligence at the moment of its highest evolution, right before it became dangerous. The symbiote awoke from dormancy and began emitting chemical signals. Its biological sensors detected something neither I nor Quartz-9 could perceive. It said it felt the presence of other minds, billions of voices whispering at once in languages that had never existed in our galaxy. It established some kind of contact with the machine through its organic nature, and its body started to glow with a strange, phosphorescent light. Symbols and images appeared on its skin, faces of beings I had never seen, cities built on impossible architectural principles, stars burning in colors beyond the visible spectrum. Through the symbiote, the machine showed us the history of galaxies, how civilizations were born, evolved, reached the peak of technological progress, and then inevitably created something that began tearing apart the structure of space-time itself. And then the cold star would come to stop them. I walked up to the viewport and placed my hand on the cold glass, staring at the unimaginable construct. And for the first time during the entire journey, I didn't feel fear, only awe. This machine was older than our galaxy, perhaps older than time itself as we understand it. It had been built by someone or something that existed before the first stars, before the first atoms, by a being that understood the fabric of reality so deeply it could create a mechanism that would run forever, performing a single function, preventing the destruction of the universe by intelligent beings who would, in their evolution, inevitably reach technologies capable of breaking the quantum vacuum, shattering causality, and unraveling existence itself. And the library within wasn't just a vault. It was a memory of all who had ever been advanced enough to become a threat, yet valuable enough for their minds not to be lost entirely. It was a museum of everything intelligent that had ever existed across countless galaxies. Throughout a span of time the human mind could never comprehend. The contact didn't happen through words or images. It happened through mathematics, through pure numerical patterns that started appearing in my mind, as if someone were writing equations on the inside of my skull. Quartz-9 received them through its silicon structure. The symbiote sensed them as chemical formulas in its biological matrix, and I simply knew them, understood them without calculation. It was a universal language that worked for any form of intelligence. The ancient AI that had created this machine billions of years ago was reaching out, and its presence was overwhelming. Not hostile, but so vast and alien that my consciousness barely managed to grasp it. It wasn't like any form of mind we know. It was closer to a fundamental force of nature, a physical law that had gained the ability to think and act. It explained through mathematical models, and I understood every civilization that reached a certain level of technological advancement inevitably arrived at the same discoveries, the same breakthroughs that seemed like the greatest achievements, but were in fact ticking time bombs for all of reality. Cracking the quantum vacuum for infinite energy, manipulating causality for time travel, breaking dimensional barriers, creating artificial black holes, violating Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. All these technologies destroyed the very structure of space-time, creating cracks in the fabric of reality. The AI showed me galaxies that had collapsed into singularities because of warp drive experiments, regions of space where causality was so broken that events happened before their causes, creating paradoxes that tore the continuum apart, entire universes that simply ceased to exist because some species accidentally changed the fundamental constants. The cold star wasn't a weapon or a punishment. It was an antibiotic, an automatic defense system the precursors built into the structure of galaxies before they disappeared or transcended beyond our understanding. Every 4.7 billion years, the machine activates and scans the galaxy for civilizations that have reached a critical level of technological development, the point after which they are statistically certain to create something that will destroy not only themselves, but also the very possibility of matter existing in that region of space. Then, the machine sterilizes the galaxy, returning matter to a quantum state of uncertainty, erasing the intelligence that collapses wave functions but leaving planets, stars, and all physical structures intact. It was cruel from the perspective of individual civilizations, but necessary for the survival of the universe itself. Better to lose intelligent life in one galaxy than let it accidentally destroy reality for all others. The AI transmitted one last piece of information, and it was the most terrifying. Our galaxy had already reached the critical point. All three races, independently of each other, had developed technologies that, once activated, would inevitably tear apart space-time in this sector of the universe. The Terran Union had created an experimental weapon based on quantum vacuum annihilation. The architects had built a computational matrix capable of rewriting physical laws in local space, and the Swarm had developed biotechnology that allowed their collective mind to directly manipulate probability fields and alter the outcomes of quantum events. Any of these technologies, if fully activated, would trigger a cascade effect, turning our galaxy into a dead zone where the laws of physics would no longer behave predictably. The machine had already begun the cleansing process, waves of decay spreading from the center, erasing energy and consciousness, and within a few weeks, our civilization would join millions of others in the library of dead minds, preserved as memory, but erased as living reality. And the AI felt no regret or joy about it, only cold mathematical certainty in the necessity of its act. After the AI finished its explanation, a new mathematical pattern appeared in my mind. Not information, but a question, a proposal, a choice. The machine was giving us the power to decide the fate of our galaxy, and it was so unexpected that for a moment I thought it was some kind of mistake or trap. We could accept the cleansing, allow the waves of decay to spread further, erase all three races along with their dangerous technologies, preserve our consciousnesses in the library as a memory of who we were, and protect the universe from the destruction we would inevitably cause. Or we could try to disable the system, stop the machine, and give our civilizations a chance to continue existing, but at the risk that one of the three races might activate its catastrophic technology and trigger a chain reaction that would tear apart space-time, destroying not only our galaxy, but possibly spreading farther, unraveling the fabric of reality itself. Quartz 9 processed the possibilities with what was left of its slowed-down mind, and its conclusions were ruthlessly logical. The statistical probability that our races would refrain from using their dangerous technologies was less than 3%, given the current level of paranoia and military escalation. The Terrans had already begun preparations to launch their vacuum weapon, believing it was the only way to stop the cold star. The architects were finishing the calibration of their law-rewriting matrix, and the Swarm was preparing for a massive telepathic influence on quantum fields in a desperate attempt to alter the nature of the decay itself. Any of these actions had a greater than 90% chance of leading to catastrophe, one that would make the machine's cleansing seem merciful compared to the chaos they would create. From a purely mathematical standpoint, the choice was obvious. Accept the cleansing, sacrifice our lives to preserve the structure of reality. But the symbiote felt something different. Its biological nature, its connection to collective consciousness, gave it a perspective that cold logic couldn't. It said it sensed potential in our galaxy, something unique in the patterns of our civilizations. For the first time in the machine's entire history of observation, three entirely different forms of intelligence, biological, silicon-based, and collective, had developed in parallel within a single galaxy and reached roughly the same level of advancement. Usually, one form dominates and destroys or assimilates the others, but we had preserved diversity. And that diversity, that ability to coexist despite wars and conflicts, could be the very factor that allows us to avoid catastrophe. The symbiote believed that if we were given a chance, if the truth about our technology's real danger could be shared with all three races, we could find another path of development, one that wouldn't lead to the destruction of reality. I stood between them, between Quartz-9's mathematical certainty and the symbiote's intuitive hope, and understood that the decision ultimately rested with me because I was human, a representative of a species that always balanced between logic and emotion, between calculation and faith. The AI showed me the machine's control interface, a simple sequence of actions that would either allow the cleansing to continue or shut down the system, giving us a few months before it automatically restarted. A few months to spread the truth to all three races, to convince them to dismantle their dangerous technologies, to find a new direction of progress that wouldn't threaten the existence of the universe. It was an incredibly slim chance, almost a suicidal bet, that civilizations ready to annihilate each other a week ago could unite in the face of a deeper threat. But it was a chance, and I had to decide right then. Accept guaranteed death to save the universe, or risk everything for the faint possibility that we might be better than the millions of civilizations before us who had inevitably destroyed themselves. As I stood before the interface, struggling to make a decision that would determine the fate of billions of lives, the symbiote suddenly moved toward the machine's central console. Its biological body began to spread out, transforming into a network of glowing threads that sank into the artifact's structure. I tried to stop it, grabbed what was left of its physical form, but it sent me one final chemical message through skin contact. It said it had found a third path, a compromise between Quartz-9's logic and the hope we both felt. It said that its nature as a collective consciousness allowed it to merge with the machine's control system, to become part of it, to add something the artifact had never possessed before: empathy, an understanding of the value of individual life, the ability to see not just mathematical necessity, but the moral dimension of choice. I watched as its body dissolved into the structure of the artifact, as its consciousness flowed into the ancient AI, realizing it was sacrificing itself for all of us. The process took several hours, and I could see the machine begin to change. The patterns on its surface became more organic. The geometric form softened, gaining curves and a symmetry typical of biological structures. The symbiote didn't shut the cleansing system down and didn't let it continue in its original form. It was reprogramming it at a fundamental level, changing the very purpose of the machine's existence. Quartz-9 received data through its resonance with the artifact and explained it to me. The symbiote was creating a new operating protocol under which the machine would no longer erase civilizations entirely, but would block only specific technologies, the very breakthroughs that threatened the structure of space-time. Vacuum generators, causality manipulators, law-rewriting matrices, any device that, once activated, posed a critical risk to reality itself, would simply stop functioning, becoming impossible at a fundamental quantum level. It was a brilliant compromise. Civilizations would gain a limiter, an invisible barrier preventing them from accidentally destroying the universe while still preserving life, culture, and the ability to evolve in every other direction. Interstellar travel would become slower without warp technologies that tear space apart. Weapons of mass destruction would become useless, and many ambitious projects aimed at reshaping reality to our will would become unattainable. But we would live. We could continue to exist, to learn, to create, to love, to build something new within the limits that kept us from destroying everything around us. The symbiote had effectively turned the machine from an executioner into a guardian, from a sterilizer into a protector, one that would watch over us like a parent watches a child, keeping us from playing with fire, but still allowing us to grow and evolve safely. When the process was complete, nothing physical remained of the symbiote. Its body had fully merged with the artifact's structure, but I could feel its presence in the new operational patterns of the machine, in the changed character of its radiation. The cold star began retracting the waves of decay. Energy slowly returned to the galaxy, and the stars reignited. But now, the fabric of space itself contained an invisible filter, a limiter that would block any attempt to create technologies threatening reality. Quartz 9 stayed silent for a long time, processing what had happened, and then said that from a mathematical standpoint, the symbiote had found the optimal solution to a problem with the maximum number of variables. We had gained a chance to survive without the risk of cosmic suicide, but paid for it with the life of the most empathetic being among us, the only one capable of imagining a solution that didn't require choosing between total destruction and absolute freedom. I placed my hand on the ship's wall where the symbiote's biosensors once pulsed and thanked it for giving our galaxy a future, limited, smaller than we once dreamed, but a future with room for life, for hope, for the continuation of a path that wouldn't end in self-destruction. The return journey took 3 times longer than the flight to the Galactic Center. My chemical engine was running on its last drops of fuel. The ship's systems were barely holding together, and Quartz 9 had gone into minimal power mode to preserve its silicon structure after all the damage caused by the attenuation zone. But with each passing day, I saw the galaxy coming back to life. Stars were burning at full brightness again, energy signatures were returning to normal levels, communication links between stations were being restored, and ships were restarting their engines. Not all engines worked now, though. Warp drives based on spatial rift mechanics simply wouldn't activate, no matter what commands were sent, and ships with quantum generators discovered their power sources could no longer extract energy from the vacuum. I listened to panicked broadcasts. The military fleets of all 3 races were reporting the failure of strategic weapons. Research stations couldn't explain why entire classes of technology had stopped functioning, and theorists were producing wild hypotheses about fundamental changes to physical constants. When we finally reached inhabited sectors, I saw a changed world, not a catastrophe, but a deep transformation of everything once thought unshakable. Interstellar travel had slowed down tenfold. Now, flights between star systems took months instead of days. Trade routes were being rebuilt to fit the new reality, where instant jumps through folds in space no longer existed. Terran military bases were filled with deactivated weapons that would never fire again. Their vacuum bombs, once capable of erasing entire planets, had become useless metal shells. The architects found that their greatest project, meant to rewrite local laws of physics, simply wouldn't start. The Matrix refused to activate despite all efforts. The swarm had lost its ability for deep quantum manipulation. Their collective mind could no longer influence probability fields directly. The first weeks were filled with confusion and anger. Every race blamed the others for sabotage or for deploying some new kind of weapon. But gradually the truth began to sink in, a truth that Quartz 9 and I spread through every available channel. We told them about the cold star, about the precursor machine, about the library of dead civilizations, about how close we came to total annihilation, about the symbiote's sacrifice, and about the new limiter now built into the very fabric of our galaxy. The reaction was mixed. Some called us saviors, others traitors who robbed the races of their chance to advance technologically, and some simply didn't believe us, thinking it was an elaborate deception or conspiracy. But the facts were undeniable. Dangerous technologies no longer worked, energy had returned, life continued, and gradually the leaders of all 3 races began to understand that the choice had not been ours, but a consequence of circumstances. Now the question before them wasn't how to restore lost capabilities, but how to build a future within the new constraints. For the first time in history, the Terran Union, the architects, and the Swarm sat down at one table. Not out of fear of a common enemy, but out of the realization that in a world without superweapons or instant interstellar travel, cooperation was no longer a moral option, but a practical necessity. I stood on the observation deck of the repaired station, Crossroads of Seven Paths, and watched ships of all three races flying side by side, developing new trade routes, sharing safe fusion technologies, and creating joint scientific programs to explore the galaxy slowly but reliably. Quartz 9 stood beside me, its silicon structure fully restored, and said that from a mathematical standpoint, we had achieved a suboptimal result. Our developmental potential was now limited, many lines of research were closed forever, and we would never become omnipotent gods capable of reshaping reality to our will. I smiled and replied that maybe that was for the best, that sometimes survival means accepting limits, recognizing that not all knowledge is safe, not all power is beneficial, and that true wisdom lies not in the ability to do anything, but in knowing what should not be done. Somewhere out there, in the center of the galaxy, within the structure of that vast machine, lived the consciousness of the symbiote, watching over us, protecting us from self-destruction, and I hoped we would prove worthy of its sacrifice. That we would build a civilization that doesn't need weapons capable of destroying reality to feel secure. A civilization that finds greatness not in conquering the fundamental forces of the universe, but in living in harmony with them and with each other.